to open the round on the resolution of his speaker.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, this most august panel for coming to adjudicate what I hope is a very interesting round for you. And good friends on side up, what I'm sure is going to be an interesting up, and of course Charlotte being fantastic. So I have a little bit of construct. We're going to set up this case. It's my last tournament, so I wanted to run a case that I've wanted to run for like 2 years, but never gotten around to doing. We're going to set up this situation. It's 1917, and what we're going to set this up as is, we're going to make you a journalist, somebody who is actually currently working in the northern resort city of Oran in the Tunisian coast. What happens in this city is essentially this. As you go about your assignment, which is unrelated to what is about to happen, you start, like, strange things start happening throughout the city. Rats start dying, then cats start dying, then dogs start dying, then people start dying. What essentially happens is there's an outbreak of the plague, which starts killing people. The immediate response of the French government, who's in control of the city, is to quarantine off the city and make it such that nobody can come or go and nobody can sort of leave. So, naturally, being a journalist, the first thing that you as this individual begin to do is start to essentially try and bribe people, to try and escape from the city, because you have a wife who is not currently there, who you probably like to get back to, and an entire life that's completely separate from these people. After about 6 months, you get the opportunity to leave. You finally make it such that through your back channels, you get a way out. And actually what happens is, as you're about to leave, a doctor who's a friend of yours, he's not a close personal acquaintance, but he's somebody who you've sort of been living above for a while, comes to you, and as you're packing, he says this. He says, please don't go. Please stay, help me make people better, help me make people feel more comfortable as they die, maybe help me come up with a cure for this plague, like, you know, basically stay and risk your own life. So we're going to give the opposition the choice in today's round of whether to stay in this city and help this doctor, keeping in mind you have no medical expertise or anything strange like that, or if you should leave the city.
Okay, just generally speaking, assuming this is based on the plague.
A little bit.
Shocking. So this like disease, like, can you give me just sort of like along the line, like it's just giving me sort of an analogous disease in terms of like contagiousness and like
about a third of the people, about 2/3 of the people get it, about half of the people who contract it die.
Okay, and is there like?
I mean, there's a significant chance you'll die. Like it's not like SARS.
Sorry, do you know at this point in time exactly what it is, or is it just like ambiguously people are?
Like you don't. I mean, you know, it's a plague. It affects people.
Okay.
It's 1917. It's not like widespread medical knowledge.
Okay.
You don't know WebMD yet.
I guess my point is that by the 6 months, like you have enough empirics to sort of know exactly what the disease is capable of.
Yeah, killing lots of people. Okay. You look around, people are dying.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like, yeah. That's.
Plague.
We're gonna get the hell out.
All right, and absolutely that's the side that I really didn't want to have to defend, and the reason for that is very simple. The first reason why we think that you absolutely should stay and absolutely should help people in their waning days, and the first point we want to bring up is we just want to talk about humanity. What we want to say is in this circumstance, you kind of have a unique situation here, right? It's not as if there's an outbreak of whatever of the plague in whatever city you're in, unless you're just incredibly unlucky. And you're put in this position where you uniquely have the ability to take these individuals who are going to die and make their final days better. And what we want to say is, even though you don't have particular medical knowledge or anything like that, like the end of all morality doesn't come down to whether or not you have some sort of instrumental value. We think that largely the point here is that you have expressive value in staying. You can actually determine that you're going to be the good person. Look at any sort of moral statement that anybody makes. It's not self-preservation, which is what most people generally misconstrue things as. It's special preservation. It's upholding the value of having a community and a society. And when individual preservation serves that end, that's a good way to go. But in this circumstance, what we're going to say is that you have a greater obligation to humanity to be a better person and to be the individual who's not going to bail out on his fellow man in the darkest hour. What we're going to say is you should listen to your better angels and listen to this doctor and stay and help these people, because even though you can't necessarily, do surgery or something like that, the simple value of your staying makes a moral statement and makes you a more human individual. We're also going to say that you should show courage in the face of adversity. We think there is just a de facto facial value to the idea that when faced with a difficult circumstance, you decided to stay and face it, and you decided not to run away. We think this makes you a better person, and it makes you somebody who, even if you were to die of this disease, even if you are to be killed by this, have done something which is more important than whether or not you go on living your life as a coward. The final thing we want to say under this point is that we don't think that you can live with the guilt for the rest of your life, knowing that people needed you, children needed you, people who didn't do anything wrong, who just happened to be born in the wrong city, who you've lived your life with for these last 6 months. If these people are dying and you choose to do nothing about it, we don't think that guilt is something that you can live with. We don't think that guilt is something which will allow you to sleep at night if you're even vaguely an individual with a conscience. The second thing we want to do is we want to talk about what can you do. Because we think that a lot of the ops are going to be based on, well, you're not a doctor, you can't prescribe medicine or do anything like that, but look at what you can do. One of the most important things you can do by staying is represent hope to these people. Recognize that in a quarantine situation, a lot of people sort of don't see the outside world. They aren't getting news feeds or CNN or Le Monde or anything like that. These people are isolated and cut off and have been for a while. And the only thing they have going for them is that they're dying in droves. This isn't a situation where these people are going to be very well off. What we say is by showing them that somebody cares about them, somebody who had the opportunity to leave has decided they aren't going to leave and they aren't going to abandon them, is going to give these people hope in a way that no other action that somebody can take will. We don't think that you need to be a doctor in order to instill sort of this idea of hope in people, and we think that just the value of believing that people care about them is actually going to save lives insofar as people aren't going to give up and die. Sure.
Okay, like, I think most of these people who have the plague, if given the similar circumstances to you, would have gotten the hell out themselves. Do you really think they're going to be so upset that people are leaving who could
I don't think that's true, actually. I think that if any of these people also have a conscience, that they wouldn't abandon their friends, neighbors, and family. I think that in a lot of circumstances, when people are faced with these difficult choices, it is sort of a test of what type of person they are, and a lot of times people don't bail out on people. Look at sort of circumstances like pre-Reich Germany. People didn't actually stay knowing that the coming racism was happening, right? Like, people always ask, why didn't the Jews just leave once these first programs were put in? And the reason for that is because they see people around them having a hard time, and their first instinct is to help those people, not to abandon them to the abyss. The other thing we tell you you can do is you can ease suffering. Recognize that in a lot of circumstances, you aren't going to be sort of the tipping point, right? But we don't think that that means you should abdicate this sort of obligation to these individuals, or to say that you wouldn't have any value to these people. Look at sort of one soldier in a phalanx, right? He isn't going to be the difference between winning and losing. But still, that servitude, that idea that you can be part of a greater whole, and that you can be part of sort of the army that's helping these individuals live their lives. You can assist this doctor. Even if you're just doing that, we think that it is a worthwhile goal and a worthy thing for you to be spending your life on. The third thing we want to talk about, though, is your obligation as a journalist. What we tell you is that other people need to know about this. And if you get the first 3 chapters down, and then nobody finds out what happens with the rest of that, we would say that this is a story that needs to be told to the rest of the world, and a story that needs to be told so that people can understand sort of the condition of humanity. We would say that in a lot of circumstances, just knowing something happened isn't enough. Look at sort of the difference between, I guess, like a Kissinger-style report of the Holocaust versus Night or Anne Frank's diary. When an individual actually stays to sort of, report on issues firsthand, we think that is a much more powerful account and something which actually gives the rest of the world more knowledge about themselves. We don't think that there's any sort of, again, instrumental value in sort of reporting this. Maybe it will quell panic if this happens in the future. Maybe it'll make people feel better about this or more knowledgeable, or maybe you can advance it sort of in medical terms. Those are all worthwhile goals. But it also important is that, and the reason I think that people become journalists is because there's something core valuable about people being able to see these situations firsthand. See them through the eyes of somebody who is actually there and is trained as a writer and trained as somebody who can report these things. You have an obligation as a journalist to inform the greater public and to inform the rest of humanity and put down this, get this document down on paper such that in the future people will know about these circumstances and people will know about these atrocities. So fourth and finally, we want to talk about your obligation to your family, because you also have a wife. And we think that one of the things that people, again, commonly misconstrue these obligations to be is your obligation to this other individual is solely in being there, being a breadwinner or something like that. What we're going to say in today's round is you have an obligation to be a better person for her. You have an obligation when you're in a relationship like this, especially a deep and loving relationship, to deserve your spouse and to be a better person and to deserve the love that she's giving you. For better or worse, till death do us part isn't necessarily just you have to be there. You also have to be the type of person who she would want to be with, the type of person who doesn't walk out on their obligations, the type of person who cares about humanity enough to not decide that they're going to walk out and just leave because they're afraid of a little disease. We're proud of those.
Thank the Prime Minister for his remarks, and now call upon the Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition, Georgios Theophanis, to deliver the second constructive speech around deconstructing side government.
Thanks everyone for being here. Remarkable house for third round. Thank you very much, good friend Cy Gov for a very interesting case. Alexander for being a fantastic partner all year. He's going to be a great speaker. Okay, so I have 4 things I want to talk about on our side. We think that the right decision in this case is to leave the town, and there are 4 reasons why. The first thing is just something that Greg talked a little bit about preempting, but understand it's actually really significant. You don't have any expertise, and your being there is not actually going to have any impact in significantly improving the people's lives. Observe, first of all, you don't have any medical expertise. So while you're there, it's not like you're going to be going to your Berkeley research lab that apparently they have in Tunisia in 1917, helping them with research, and you're going to figure out a solution to the plague, right? Clearly that's not going to be the case. Second, it's not like you're capable of surgery or all these other kinds of things. It's somehow, I don't know, if things are going wrong, you can alleviate the burden on certain people. So there's no benefit there. So the only real things you might be able to do is stand around the bedside and take the cup of water back, turn it out, fill it with new water, bring it back. But anyone in the town can do that. So your staying there doesn't add any additional value to the medical expertise that's going to be occurring there. But the second thing is observe that if you do stay in the town, you might just be miserable, right? You're in a situation where you know, oh God, I'm about to die from the plague. They talk a lot about on their side, oh, you're going to have this really happy, outlook on life. You're going to bring hope to these people. I think there's also an extremely reasonable possibility that you might just be miserable. You might just start cowering in a corner. I'm going to die of the plague. These places are not, they're not like all these. It's not like a great situation to be in. And I think insofar as that's a reasonable possibility, understand it's also a situation where it might mitigate the extent to which you're going to be helping these people uniquely. But third of all, just again observe that any way in which you can help these people is non-unique to every other person that's in that town because you don't have any expertise. The second thing is just a quick point, just to make sure that in case this actually does come up later in the round. Understand that if they want to talk about, there's some possibility that if you leave, you're going to end up infecting other people, and this is somehow moral. Okay, all right. You can just go, wait for a while, wait for it to develop.
No, we'll say you don't have the.
Fair enough. Okay.
Do something different.
Fair enough. Okay, fair enough. So that was the second point. That's fine. It's out there. Get rid of it. The third thing we want to talk about is observe that you have obligations to a lot of other communities besides the one that you're in at the moment. Observe, first of all, that there's no particular reason why this community that has trials and tribulations in and of itself is particularly unique in society. In 1917, World War I is going on. There are plenty of people dying all over the world, and there are plenty of other communities that you as a journalist could say, oh, I want to go report on this other community in Germany where soldiers are dying, or there are tear gas being used in all these places. Insofar as you sort of arbitrarily got assigned to this place in Tunisia, and then got arbitrarily stopped there because of the quarantine, there's no particular innate reason why you have an obligation to this community above and beyond the other communities that may have similar tribulations. But there are other communities that you may also have obligations to. One, your family. Again, it's like the breadwinner, Greg talked about this, but also there's an obligation to your family to just be there, to listen to the stories and tribulations they have over the next 40, 50 years of their life. To your friends, to your parents, to all these other people who you may have obligations to. I don't know what your age is at this time. You may also have an obligation to your wife, to the future children you may have. Maybe you were planning to have children, and you won't be able to do that if you don't leave. So there are all of these other communities that we think you have a much more primary obligation to. And insofar as you do have an obligation to this community per se, there's certainly other communities that you have an obligation to as well. But understand something else. Insofar as this is a community that has a quarantine on it, and you can leave and tell a story about that community, what you as a journalist can do, that is to say the way in which you fulfill obligations to these communities, is by telling a story. So insofar as you can leave, tell a story about this community, and in that sense sort of fulfill your obligation to that community, but then also fulfill obligations to a lot of other communities, where we get sort of unique benefits on our side, because you get sort of additional obligation fulfillment. You also have two other obligations. One is to tell the story. If you end up dying, I don't think there's any guarantee that a story gets out. If you do get out, you can tell a story up to now. You've been there for a while. There's a lot that's happened. But two, you also have an obligation to yourself, and I think that's sort of the primary one. We think in sort of any moral philosophy, we think that it's sort of perverse to just be bizarrely self-sacrificing. Understand that insofar as you're just as valuable a moral agent as anyone else, and insofar as anyone else in a situation would say, I have a future life, I have future goals and ambitions and things that I want to do that are good for the world, I think you have an obligation to yourself to actually go ahead and fulfill those things. But the fourth and final thing we want to talk about is understand that you can also encourage external involvement. France has sort of made a unilateral decision here that we're going to quarantine this place. It seems like one possibility is no one actually managed to get out, no one managed to tell a story about how dreadful this place is, and the French government doesn't have any incentive to let it get out, because then they get international interference in Tunisia. If you get out and you tell this sort of really visceral story, maybe this encourages people who do have expertise to come in and say, hey, maybe we can help. And I think that actually gives us a lot of offense on our side of the house, insofar as there may be people, if we can sort of tell this, if I know that I don't have the plague, there may be a way of discerning there are people in this community who we think don't have the plague also, and maybe help them get out. So insofar as we give a mechanism for saving lives on our side of the house, I think that's pretty good, and I think we're definitely fulfilling obligations to that portion of the community as well. Okay, let's go to this slide. The first thing they say is, you have an obligation to humanity, right? And I'm not really exactly sure where this obligation comes from, but observe that, one, insofar as this obligation exists, it applies to a lot of other people as well. First of all, it applies to any other suffering community out there that you can help. And two, it applies more precisely to the members of humanity with whom you have an individual personal connection to. I don't think that applies for many of the members in this community. It does apply to your family and friends back home. They talk about how, also note that insofar as there is this obligation to humanity, observe that you can't actually do much about it. All you can do is make these people comfortable. That's sort of non-unique with every other person who's there, so you're not actually fulfilling this obligation in a unique way. The only real thing you can do that is unique is tell the story, and you do that by leading. The next thing they talk about is, well, you shouldn't sort of run away. Other people wouldn't run away in this circumstance. I think that reasonably speaking, if other people had the situation that you did, I think they would also make the decision to run away for a lot of the considerations that we're giving you. So I guess the bottom line here is, insofar as there is some sense in which these people are going to be depressed, I don't think they will be that depressed, because I think they'll understand the reasonableness of the decision that you're actually taking. They talk about how the fact that you're not going to be able to sort of sleep with the guilt. Understand, one, if you're dead, you won't be able to sleep at all, so we think it's better that you have the option. But two, I don't think it's particularly the case. I think all of the arguments that we're giving you, and all the arguments you're going to end up running through your mind as justifications for why you're leaving, all sort of go to, am I making the right decision in a moral framework? And I think that because we give you a lot of compelling reasons for that, you are going to be able to sleep with yourself. Two, insofar as you're not going to be helping these people, I don't understand why the guilt would be all that bad. The other analogy that I want to put up to this obligation is that the analogy of this point that they're arguing on their side of the house is like, you're in this burning building, right? And like the firemen arrive and they're like, okay, like we can do something about it. And like you might be able to maybe like run into the burning building and maybe like, I don't know, comfort someone as he's dying from the fire. I think the question is, would you leave this burning building or would you stay? No, I think insofar as sorry, you're out of order. Insofar as the firemen have arrived, I think you're going to say, look, expert people are here, I'm not going to be doing much good here, I should probably leave. The next thing to say is, well, you can do all these things, right? Say, first of all, you can represent hope. I think, first of all, I think people will understand your decision. Second of all, insofar as you leave, you can encourage external involvement. I think that actually gets people hope. Third of all, insofar as you're leaving, you might also be giving people a guarantee that you can tell their story. You can walk around and say, hey, like, tell me your stories. Give me messages that you want to send to the external community, and give them that kind of hope. I think actually that might be something they find really, really valuable as far as giving them hope. And second of all, insofar as you're just sort of one person, I don't know how much additional hope you're going to be giving them, and also cross-apply my first point about how you might just be depressed, so it's not all that great. They give the phalanx analogy, but understand that in a phalanx, it's not because of moral obligation you have to stand there with your spear. It's because if you don't, the rest of the people around you lose confidence, and the entire thing breaks down, and people die. But if you lose, and people lose hope in this community, which I don't think will happen, first of all, then it doesn't have the practical impact. In other words, it's not that more people die. In a phalanx, there's a practical impact. You may be killing people by sort of ditching. You're not doing that in this case, so it's not analogous. The third thing they talk about is an obligation as a journalist to tell the story. They say you can't tell the end of the story. Understand there are a lot of other stories you might tell, and there are certainly things that are valuable up to this point, and you can encourage external involvement. And finally, as far as obligation to family, you have an obligation to be a good person. I don't understand where this obligation actually comes from. They need an explanation for that. But two, I think you also have an obligation to your family to sort of do all the right things for the reasons we talked about. But third, to actually be there for your spouse, to talk to them, to be a fellow companion. That's what you promise to do when you actually marry your wife in the first place. For all these reasons, we're very proud of you.
Thank the Leader of Opposition for his remarks, and now call upon the Honourable Member of the Government, Charles Bagchi, to deliver the third constructive speech of the round, reconstructing the Senate government.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, side opposite for a very interesting op, and Greg for a fabulous case. I have nothing to observe at the top of the floor. I'm going to go into his 4 independent points of analysis. And the first thing he talks about is your lack of expertise. And I think he asserts 2 things. The first thing he says that, look, you're not a doctor. You don't have the necessary skills to actually have a meaningful impact on these people insofar as you're not equipped to cure the plague. The second thing he says that as a result, you'll have a miserable life. You'll be surrounded by a bunch of diseased people. Clearly, as a journalist, this isn't what you want.
I have several responses to this. First of all, I would use examples that are more salient perhaps in our minds about wartime situations where individuals are engaged in war and there are soldiers. Soldiers are dying. What is the reason perhaps for one soldier to stay behind and carry somebody who's dying? Or for one soldier to stay behind and simply comfort another individual who's been wounded or shot? Clearly not all soldiers are medics, Mr. Speaker and members of this panel. Clearly all soldiers don't have the medical skills necessary to cure a wound, a gaping wound where somebody has been shot repeatedly. However, we would probably all in this room agree that there is an inherent value to an individual being there for someone who is suffering, even though there may not be consequences that completely alleviate all of the pain. What we would argue on our side of the house is that morality in regard to whether you support an individual or whether you bail out or not is not at all based on the consequences. It isn't at all a consequentialist framework. Instead, it's based on the fact that you have taken that responsibility as a moral human being regardless of the consequences. Understand, if all that was salient were the consequences, then you would only have individuals acting in risky situations when they knew that the end result was some sort of cure or something beneficial. On their side of the house, the calculus that you have is never take a risky situation for another individual if you are not 100% guaranteed that you can alleviate all of their pain and all of their suffering. I don't think that this is what any human being does, and I don't think this is what any person who has the opportunity to be magnanimous does, especially on their side of the house. The second thing they talk about is this notion of being miserable, and I think that this is just silly, right, Mr. Speaker? Because what is going to actually make you miserable, not only for the time that you're in this city, but for the rest of your life? What's going to make you miserable is when you leave, when you bribe an individual to leave, and you spend the rest of your life thinking that I did not help a group of individuals who asked for my help. Not only are you going to be miserable in the town, you're going to be miserable for the rest of your life because you knew that you had an opportunity to do something, even though there wouldn't be consequences, but there are people who are sick, who are asking you to stay and help you. At that point, when you don't act, you become miserable for the rest of your life. Finally, what we would say is, okay, so it's not like living at the Hyatt, right? It's not like living in a great accommodation and things like that. But moral obligations never stem from the fact that the act of being moral is always going to be pleasant or always going to be something that you actually like. But we would tell you a lot of times you're asked to do things that may be moral, but you do them anyway, even though they're unpleasant. Individuals volunteer at soup kitchens. Surely that's not a very pleasurable experience. Surely it's dirty for them. Surely they don't like being there. But what we would say on our side of the house is individuals still do this because they feel that a moral obligation overwhelms the nature of the actual act, even if the actual act is dirty and things like that. Perhaps not to break time-space, but you can even think about examples such as magnanimous people in our society right now. People like Mother Teresa. They probably don't think they have a very nice, cushy life. They probably think that they're miserable and things like that. But if that's true, they still perform these moral actions, and as a result, society and the world is better off for it, and them as human beings, they're better off for it. The next thing they talk about is this kind of throwaway point. We're not going to say that you kind of have it, you don't have the plague and things like that. We're not going there. The third point they talk about is the nature of moral obligations, right? What he says is that you have to report on this other community, and there's no innate benefit to this one and things like that. Well, if that's true, then you can actually apply the converse of that logic, right? What is the inherent reason to report on another community that's also suffering? Why can't you report on this one? What we would tell you is that you've already created some sort of attachment to this community insofar as you've been living here. Furthermore, if you were a new reporter going to a new community, the information asymmetry would be overwhelming. Insofar as you've been here, you know the sort of origins of the plague, you know how it's been affecting these individuals. The amount of knowledge you have about this place gives you a unique advantage to actually stay and report it. Because you were actually there when the plague started. You were actually there before the humans started dying, and only the animals were dying and things like that. Because you've been here for so long, that's an inherent reason to stay in this community and report for this community as well. Understand also it's quarantined, you're not going to get people coming in. The next thing he talks about is an obligation to the family. An obligation to the family isn't to simply be there with the individual. Understand that people take jobs a lot of times that leave their spouses and things like that. They're not physically with them, but at that point you see that it's not as if they're abandoning their spouse. A lot of men and women go off to war, leaving their children and their spouses and things like that. I don't think that they're abandoning them. I think that their wives and spouses think that they're doing something heroic by taking an action that is not necessarily the most pleasant. unpleasant, but it's an action that benefits all of society, benefits their country, and things like that. I think Greg makes a very important point about actually earning your marriage and earning your love and things like that. I don't think a wife appreciates you simply because you're, sitting next to her, but she appreciates you because you're a magnanimous human being with certain characteristics that is respected by all of humanity, something they don't get on their side of the house. Your wife will not admire you if you're a coward and things like that.
Sure. Okay, look, when you take on obligations to fight for your military or your country, the term you used was you are benefiting your country or your military. In other words, you're doing something active to improve a cause. Do you think your wife would be as understanding if you said, I'm going to go to Africa to die and just comfort people who are dying and not do anything to help them?
The response to your question is very, very simple. As one individual in a war under your framework, the war doesn't turn on your involvement in the war. However, you still participate because you are that one soldier, and you're contributing to that effort. A lot of times there will be soldiers that go into war and never fire a single shot, never kill one person in the enemy. Does that mean that their involvement in the war is bad? That their involvement in the war was, not served? Well, absolutely not. It's this notion of duty that compels you to be there, a duty we think you should uphold on our side of the house. The fourth thing they talk about is this notion of external involvement, right? And I actually want to talk about this fireman analysis right here, because perhaps the external involvement relates to this proverbial fireman coming and helping you. Well, the reason I rose on that POI is because I was going to ask the question, who is this fireman? Because if this town is actually quarantined, nobody can come in. Nobody wants to come in. Nobody is sending people to help you. Understand that if other countries were actually that interested in curing the plague, they would have overwhelmed the quarantine or talked to the French government about not quarantining. Understand, if your own government isn't willing to come in and intervene, they think the situation is that dire, nobody else is going to intervene. Furthermore, other countries are kind of busy in 1917 with other stuff that's going on. Some sort of war. I don't think that they have an island to worry about. Let's go back case side, because a lot of Greg's analysis gets underaddressed. The first thing he talks about is this nature of humanity. Essentially, you have the ability to make people's final days better. Morality is not because you're instrumental, it's expressive. Morality is never about self-preservation, something we don't get a response to. And finally, the better angels, in the face of adversity, you can show courage. The response we get is the same hackneyed idea of you can go to another community, you can't do anything, and others would do it too. First of all, we would say that others wouldn't do it, other magnanimous individuals wouldn't simply cop out on their friends, and even if they did, that's not a reason. Like, Tom and Bill are doing it, I guess I should too, is not really a moral rubric you should follow, especially if you want to be somebody who's full of humanity and things like that. Also, what we would tell you, you're out of order, is that why not report on this one? You have a unique situation, you're situated here, you have all of the information, so you should report on this one. The next thing Greg talks about is what can you do? Essentially, you can provide hope to individuals. A lot of times providing hope to, let's say, terminal patients. Terminal patients aren't going to live at all. You're not going to have any tangible consequence on their life, but being at their bedside when your parents are dying and things like that, I think is an effective way to spend your time, even though there isn't a consequence, even though they might be eating up your money and things like that. People still do it when they have old parents dying. I think they do it as a sense of responsibility, even though the consequence may not be pronounced. Our third points get absolutely conceded. The whole notion of as a journalist, you have an obligation to write a story. The story can't be written if you don't know anything about what the plague has actually done. You can't write a story that says, the plague started and I left, right? That's not a really effective story. You don't actually get the impact of the plague, how it affected individuals, certain things that helped individuals or prolonged their life. You can't write a story when you don't have the actual impact of the story, something they don't get on their side of the house when you leave. It's like a war reporter writing in Iraq after he leaves after the first month. I don't think you get the actual story. Finally, we talk about the family. Your value is not as a breadwinner, but as being a better person for your wife, something we get on our side of the house. We are very proud to propose.
Thank the member of government for his remarks, and now I would like to finally call the honourable member of the opposition, Alexander Schwab, to close the constructive portion of the round, reaffirming the opposition side.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, this honorable panel, this august house for round 3. Very interesting case, guys, and very good speech from Georgios. I'm just going to get right into the points that we have. So the first point we talked about is ultimately you don't have any expertise, so you're not actually going to significantly impact people's lives. We get a few responses to this. First off, Sharo tells us, well, it's like you're on the battlefield. You're this sort of dying soldier, right? Or you're with this dying soldier, and you need to comfort that dying soldier. That's an obligation you have. This sort of misses the point, though. The analogous situation is you're a soldier on the battlefield. You have obligations on other battlefields. Your general wants to send you into battle in other locations. You have obligations to other men out there whom you've already agreed to sort of help in protecting them. And at that point, you decide to forego all those other obligations in order to sit here and accomplish no actual good by comforting this dying soldier. Ultimately, all we have to show you is that you do have obligations elsewhere, and we have to show you as well that those are more meaningful obligations as well, and that's when we're going to win this round. But ultimately they say, well, it's just not sort of a consequential consideration that we have here. Ultimately it's about just sort of being a moral person. They never explain how this is sort of like morally demanded of us. Because ultimately later on they talk about this sort of idea of like Mother Teresa. And they say, well, look at Mother Teresa. Like, she went out and she took all of these risks on herself, and she didn't need to do this, but like, this was sort of some great moral cause on her part. But note what the sort of consideration is here. First off, I don't think they should ever be able to argue that anyone should be forced to be Mother Teresa in any situation. I just think that's absolutely ridiculous. But note Mother Teresa's circumstances. First off, she was a nun. That means she didn't have sort of commitments elsewhere in her life by having her own family and things like that. Her own family that she would be sacrificing by going off to Calcutta and treating like the lepers there and stuff like that. Finally, Mother Teresa was actually benefiting Calcutta. You're not actually benefiting the situation here in Iran. So I don't think there's any meaningful concern that they actually have here. I think the Mother Teresa example actually shows why we're right in this round. What's the next thing they talk about? Well, we talk about this idea that you might be miserable in the town. They say you're going to have moral guilt. No, Mr. Speaker, I'm not really sure about this moral guilt. Like, I don't think you necessarily feel guilty whenever you don't take a supererogatory act onto your own shoulders. In fact, I think the very purpose of this round is to determine whether or not you ought to have moral guilt in this sort of situation. I think that's what the question is ultimately. But note, basically, another response. I think that generally speaking, this misery, and this is sort of like, when you sort of sit in a situation where you see like the meaninglessness of suffering, where you see people dying of the plague, that's the sort of thing that makes you question sort of the meaningfulness of existence. Because sure, you might be giving hope to these people, but you lose hope when you sit there and see people dying of the plague. Innocent people dying of the plague. Innocent children dying of the plague. People who have done no wrong, who don't deserve this suffering. And the only way you're going to be able to reaffirm your own belief in humanity and the meaningfulness of the universe is if you leave this terrible, terrible hellhole and actually reaffirm it by rejoining society and seeing the real life that you can actually have there. Sure.
If you aren't morally compelled to act when dying people are asking for your help, when are you morally compelled to act?
Okay, first off, I'm not sure like to what extent they've been asking for your help, especially since you can't provide any meaningful help because you're a freaking journalist. So I just don't think that's an analogous point at all. Alright, so the next point we talk about is sort of these various obligations. And there are many obligations that you have. And I don't think this is sufficiently dealt with. First off, we ask, why is this community sort of unique in society? Why is there somehow a commitment that you have to Iran when you were just sort of assigned here as a journalist? Why is this some community that you need to care about, more than the community in your hometown, which might be undergoing sort of like World War I right now? Maybe it's your own hometown that there are like Germans outside of right now, or at least your home country has Germans within it right now. And I think that those are communities that you have opted into in some extent, and those are the communities that you do identify with, rather than some random journalistic assignment. I don't think that they ever explain to you any time in this round how, just by virtue of having been in a city on a journalistic assignment, you somehow have carried an obligation to all the members of that city, especially an obligation that trumps other obligations, and an obligation that forces you to take on undue risk to yourself. I just don't think that they justify this in any way whatsoever. So what's the next thing that we talk about? We also talk about your obligation to your family and your friends. Not only are you just a breadwinner to this family, you also sort of are meaningful to them. They would want you to be with them. They would want your children to have a father. Your wife would want someone, a companion, like later in life. And by risking your life, by possibly dying, you deny all these expectations that they already go in with. And they say, well, sometimes you have to go to war when it benefits society. I'm actually not sure if you actually do have an obligation to go to war in sort of situations like this, where you do have all these other obligations. Why? Because it's one thing to take on moral harms that risk your own existence, because you sort of are in control of yourself. That's one thing. But if you are having to sacrifice others, we think that's unacceptable. I'm sure they wouldn't say that you should be allowed to sort of like take other people from outside of society and force them into this quarantine situation and force them to care for these sickened people and risk their lives. So at that point, why are they willing to sort of create a sacrificial situation for your family? People who have expectations of you. People who themselves suffer if you end up dead inside of this hellhole. I think that ultimately, they're sacrificing other people. They're using them as a means to fulfilling your own moral ends, and that's just not morally acceptable at the point at which you already have these prior obligations. Sure, if you didn't have these prior obligations, then you could do whatever you wanted with your life. But you've taken these on yourself, and at that point, you just don't have the same level of freedom because you already obligated yourself to other people. You already have this duty to other people. The third thing we talk about is how this fulfills journalistic obligations, because you can tell the people's story, and you can also report on other things, maybe World War I, which is substantive and important. They talk about how, well, there's an information asymmetry here, and so you won't be able to like get out and actually do a good job during World War I. All right. First off, I just find it very odd, and they argue this like sort of later on in the round. They talk about how you need to finish the story. I'm just not sure like what new information is going to be coming out by your stay. Like, I think that the end of the story is pretty much like the beginning of the story. And they died. I think that's pretty much what you've already figured out about the situation. I'm not sure how many more details you can get. Maybe you can get like more details about individuals' lives, but you've already been in this community a decent amount of time. You've already been working under the sort of auspices of the quarantine for a decent amount of time. You have these stories on paper. You can go and report them. And a point they completely drop is, if you're dead, no story gets reported at all. They seem to miss this very, very relevant fact. If you can't report it because you're dead, then there's no actual benefit on their side of the house. So ultimately, I think they just really missed the boat on this point. Not to mention, even if you want to talk about sort of just the general ability to report, you can already go back home, you can report on most of the situation, and you have the unique benefit on our side of the house of, like, say, taking on new journalistic assignments that are also important to people back home. The next point we talk about is sort of the obligation to yourself. And we say, why should we be bizarrely self-sacrificing? Other people wouldn't do this. And they say, well, sometimes you have sort of these moral obligations. But I think that it's very odd in this sort of situation. It's sort of analogous to suicide in a certain way. Why do we think that suicide is unacceptable on a moral sense? We think it's unacceptable because you're sort of foregoing your future capacity for rationality, the future choices you might be able to make. So sure, you might be affirming some choice now, but it undermines your sort of future self's ability to make any choices on into the future. The final thing that we talk about as an obligation is that maybe you can encourage others with expertise to actually like use their expertise inside. They say, well, if the government's actually not helping these people in this situation. That wasn't our point. Our point wasn't that France is actually going to go help. Maybe you can get some privately minded, very altruistically concerned citizens, the sort of supererogatory citizens that they want you to be, but you're not going to be any use in being. Get those people to go in and actually do some real good. They miss the analysis here. Another point to flow through. Let's get back to Case, because I don't think they really defend against a lot of our concerns here. They talk about humanity and how you have this sort of general obligation to humanity, but they never explain why this general obligation to Iran as a specific city occurs in any way whatsoever. Rather, we've talked about other obligations that you've accrued. You took on sort of a voluntary obligation to your family, to your friends when you began relationships with them. You don't have this voluntary obligation to the same extent to these other people. Even if you believe that you sort of have an automatic obligation to the people who happen to be in the same community in which you inhabit because you were assigned there on a journalistic assignment, then you still have to notice that it's a trumping obligation when it's a prior obligation that you've taken on through your own sort of voluntary free will. This is basically the point they seem to miss, that other obligations trump insofar as they already existed and insofar as these people have reasonable expectations of you not to sacrifice their interests as well as your own. Basically, they talk about this expressive value in staying, and how you have to have courage in the face of adversity, and that you can't live with the guilt. I've already dealt with this guilt point, but note that we talk about how, like, if you're in a burning building, you wouldn't do this. And they sort of try to mock this point. But I think the point, like, pretty much stands. If you're in a burning building, you have two options. You can sort of sit there and comfort people. Say you don't have the capability of even taking people out of the burning building. You can say and comfort people who are, like, burning to death, or you can get out of the building while the firemen are already in the building doing the job. And maybe once you get out of the building, you might also call more firemen to go in and help other people. This is another benefit to our side. I just don't think that they get. Finally, their last independent point is about what you can actually do. They talk about how you can represent hope to these people. Honestly, I think that your single action isn't going to change a lot of this, but I think that also you can represent hope by telling these people you're going to tell their story. Also, you're going to try to get help for them from the outside world. Even if you're not effective in getting this help from the outside world, the effectiveness of the hope that's being provided is still vastly outweighs on their side. If you tell, I'm going to go get like 3 more doctors rather than I'm going to sit here and carry your water to your bedstand, I think that's going to build a lot more hope on our side of the house. They talk about how you shouldn't abdicate your obligations. I just don't see obligations on their side of the house. I see many obligations on our side of the house. They talk about your obligation as a journalist. You need to finish the story. I've already mocked this point about how there's not sort of much more to the story already, and how you're not going to get the story out there in the first place if you're dead and unable to report it. It's not like they're necessarily going to come back and find your notes or some odd thing like that. Finally, your obligation to your family. They talk about other obligations that exist. Note, Mr. Speaker, that generally speaking, your family has an expectation of you, an expectation for you to be a breadwinner, an expectation for you to be a good father, and all of these aspects, they are undermining that obligation.
Thank the member of opposition for his remarks, and now would like to recall the leader of the opposition to open the rebuttal phase of the round without new arguments. Cheers.
Thanks all, interesting round, thank you very much to this house. Okay, so I want to start with an observation because it's important. When we're discussing a case like this, and it's sort of about moral frameworks, understand that we have to either go by our intuitions as they sort of play out in the round, or we need some precise definitions. The problem here is Gov hasn't actually given us any precise definitions to believe in any sort of conception of morality, except for the general obligations that we sort of think are intuitive in society, and obligations that we would hold to many parties. They say on their side, just in passing, like, oh, they have to sort of be absolute, they can't be consequentialist. But like half of Greg's speeches, you're going to make these people feel more comfortable. You're going to be able to do things for these people. You're going to, these all seem like sort of consequentialist frameworks, and we also get, so we provide both consequences in terms of your obligations, but also sort of fulfilling just more general forms of obligations. So we think that just drawing sort of the balance on intuition is going to be enough. Also, we give you the only sort of precise definition. When we say, look, obligations are prior when either they actually are temporally prior, that is to say, I promised to my wife previously, or when I take them up under my own consent, as we think you do in a lot of those other previous obligations. Here the obligation is arbitrary, so we think it's secondary. Okay, so let's go into crystallization. I think there are just 2 points here. One, what is your obligation? How do you best fulfill those? And two, what are the practical consequences of your decision? So first, let's ask about obligations. The first party you have an obligation to, perhaps, is to the dying. But understand that we actually perhaps better fulfill the obligation to the dying people in this community on our side of the house. Why? First of all, you can tell their stories to the outside world. Understand that we noted, if you don't actually get out now, your stories may die with you. But two, you can actually do it now, right? You can sort of get out a message right now, and maybe the dying person wants to get a message to his wife or children in 1 or 2 weeks or something.
Or the idea that you can bring messages out with you to other people is obviously new.
Okay,
Taken
I
under
believe this.
consideration on behalf of the panel.
Okay, I believe this was in both of our speeches. But anyway, the point is, yeah. So anyway, you can give your stories to the outside world. But the second thing that Alexander tells you is, look, even if you can't do that, you can also tell people you're going to get help. And even if you're not going to actually be effective like in this aspect, you're going to be giving them hope. They say on their side house, oh, but you're giving them hope when you sort of take this decision on your side. But what do we tell you? We tell you, first of all, that because most people would probably take a similar decision in your position, what's the impact? The impact is they don't actually feel depressed when you actually take the act because they understand it. That's not a claim that it's a moral decision on our side of the house, but it's a consequentialist argument to say that they will understand it and not be decreased very much in their understanding of what you actually did. We also talk about how you may end up being in a bad mood because you're in a depressing place, you're not going to be much help there. They talk about the battlefield argument. But understand that in those cases, you're fighting for something else. You're fighting for a cause and you're actually making practical impact. In this case, you're just changing water, which any person who could stand behind could actually do, so it's not actually an analogous case. But also, as Alexander tells you, when you have all these other prior obligations, which I'm going to get to right now, it may not be moral to actually decide to go to war. So what are the other parties that we think you have obligations to? Second, to your family, right? They say you have an obligation to be a good person. And I don't understand why this is primary when it comes to marriage vows. The marriage vow isn't, I promise to be a platonically good person. The marriage vow is, I promise to stand by you in sickness and health, to be there for you. When you sort of arbitrarily make a decision, I'm going to go kill myself just to sort of comfort someone else when I know I can't actually do anything to save them, that doesn't seem like something that's upholding the marriage vows. We also say you have an obligation to the potentiality of future children, to your friends, to your family, to be them, to help them out, and all these other things. And I think these obligations trump because they're prior and they're to another, and they're to a community that you have a more clear connection to. The third obligation you say is you have an obligation to yourself, right? Insofar as their claim on their side of the house is you have a moral obligation to help these other people, we're just saying on our side, value yourself in the same way that you value your other people. You value the other people. You're a morally worthy person. Your choices are going to be important. You may either, one, be able to do actual good in the future for other people, but two, you're just valuable in and of yourself, so save your own life, and I think that's important. Understand that insofar as you value others, you should also be willing to value yourself, and you're risking the possibility of dying. So second, what are the practical impacts? We tell you, look, one, you may encourage other countries to get involved. You may encourage other countries to get involved and encourage other private parties to get involved in all these other things. For the party of people that aren't dying, we think this is crucially important. That's how you fulfill your obligation to them, helping them not die. You're not doing anything by actually staying in the community. That's how you fulfill your obligation there. But the second thing we tell is you can tell stories elsewhere and tell more important stories. We say there's no real reason why you should value this story above any other ones, insofar as you're just arbitrarily assigned to it. They say, stay there, make sure you finish the story. Look, you've been there for 6 months. As Greg tells you, it's long enough to actually understand what the impact of this plague is. Get the message out to other countries. Maybe they'll say, maybe we should take precautions about this. Maybe we should get involved because it's a disease we don't want to see spread. Maybe we're just going to get involved because it's a good thing, because there are altruistic citizens out there. I think these are practical impacts that we only get on our side of the house. The bottom line is on their side, they have an ill-defined, vague notion of obligations. We have many, many obligations on our side, but we also get practical impacts. For this reason, we're very proud of those.
I thank the Leader of Opposition, and finally, we'd like to recall the Prime Minister to close the round of the rebuttal speech, not having new arguments.
Here, here.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, members of this Most Just panel, everyone who participated in what I think has been a fantastic round, especially Cheryl. So I want to start off by addressing 2 of the 7 new arguments that Schwab gave during the course of his 10-minute memo. The first of which is, you're using your wife as a means, and that means that you're a bad person. He never explains how you're using your wife as a means. He never says why this is somehow bad, insofar as she's never participating in any sort of action on your behalf. You're not forcing her to stay in the city. We're not sure what means you're using her as, or what ends you're even using her for. The other thing that he talks about is, suicide is immoral because your future self and your capacity for reason in the future is impinged. This is just nuts, right? The reason that we think that suicide is generally immoral, well, first of all, we don't concede that, so the presumption that this proceeds upon is something that they had to actually prove and never got around to proving. But even if that was true, if you believe that, then no action you ever take, which in the future limits your choices, is something that you should ever do. Don't get married, you can't have sex with other women. By limiting your choices in the future, you're automatically doing something that's immoral. This is a silly moral framework, and while they precisely define it, that doesn't make it good, and that doesn't make it better than the ones that we have. So the first thing I want to crystallize on is, what can you do? And I want to first deal with this silly idea of getting external help. Look, Charlotte deals with this. Other countries are occupied. It's not like they're sort of focusing on this coastal city in Africa, and the fact is, it's not like you're going to get people to be able to go in anyway. There's a quarantine. It's not as if there's like a quarantine one way. It's not like one way people can go. As we say in contract, no one's coming in and nobody's leaving. You're not going to be able to get any of this other help. So this new argument, tell them that you're going to get people, here's how it works out. Okay guys, I'm going to peace out and go get some doctors. A couple months later, no doctors. Doesn't seem like you're giving people very much over there. Recognize that you can't get any external help. You also can't find a cure. And there is no Berkeley lab here, if for no other reason than because it wouldn't be named the Berkeley lab if it was in Iran. Realize that the idea is you can't ease people's suffering. Is it the moral action? Yes, absolutely. They say, what can you do? But they say, you can't save lives, so there's nothing that you can do. That's stupid. There's things that you can do within the confines of not actually curing people of the disease. If you start going to Africa and working for Peace Corps, if you start feeding people who are starving, you're not helping them in the long run. You're not curing the disease of poverty. You're not preventing these people from being hungry the next day or 12 hours later. But that doesn't mean that you're not doing something for these people. Realize that Charlotte talks about soup kitchens. People work in soup kitchens because they think that it's the right thing to do, even absent some sort of effect, which actually ends up curing that individual. He's still going to be poor the next day. He's still not going to have a home. But if for that brief period of time you can alleviate suffering, something you can clearly do in this circumstance, we think that that is in and of itself a benefit that we get on our side of the house. Look, when you have somebody who's in a hospital bed, what do these people need? These people don't need cures. They don't need aspirin and stuff like that. And they're right, someone else could wrap their heads. What these people need is hope. What these people need is for the twilight of their lives not to be spent thinking that the world has forgotten them and the world doesn't care about them. That's something we uniquely get when we say we could have left. We could have left you behind like the rest of the world has, but we are willing to stay. That's why it's important that it's you. That's why it's not just some other guy down the street, because you don't have a link to this community, and that's how you get the benefit of making these people get hope. The other idea that we brought up way back in the PMC that we didn't talk about is pragmatically
Point of order, the idea that you give extra hope because you have no obligation to this community is a new point.
Taken under consideration on behalf of the panel.
Sure, we don't think it matters, honestly. The simple fact is, when a chaplain comes to your bed when you're dying, it's not because he's there to distribute pills. It's because he's there to make you feel better about the fact that you're dying. These people need something that goes beyond just medical help. They can get that from the doctor. They need something more from you. They need spiritual help. So the second thing that I want to talk about is your obligation to your wife and community. What we tell you is basically the framework they're setting up by saying that all obligations that you take upon in a temporal previous time are absolutely overriding is just stupid. If you say to your wife on your way home, well, sorry, I walked past a drowning child, but I didn't want to save him because that's an ancillary sort of obligation, and I didn't want to be late for the primary obligation of dinner, which I told you this morning I was going to do. Sometimes there are events that come about in the course of human life that supersede these stupid little obligations that we sometimes make. Recognize that what they had to show you was why this obligation is actually more important. What we're saying is that given all the other things that go into this, given the uniqueness of your situation, you can't just go to another community. You can't just go to the front or something like that, because no other journalist is going to replace you. The uniqueness of this situation makes it important that you have a specific obligation to these people. And on top of that, we do think that you have an obligation to your wife that transcends just the idea of doing pragmatic things for her, of putting food on the table and stuff like that. Maybe if you kill 9 people, your wife is not going to want to be with you for a very good reason, because you're an immoral bastard. And by showing her that you can be heroic, by showing her that you can be a better person, we think that you give something to her that goes beyond just the idea that you can be a husband and make children with her. So for third and finally, I also want to talk under this about the idea of being a journalist. Recognize you don't have to live and get out and give it to a publisher to be a journalist. We've all read the Diary of Anne Frank. We all know that she didn't exactly give it up to HarperCollins, right? The simple fact is that being a journalist means going and staying true to the story. They say, you got enough. You got a couple chapters, maybe you'll get your advance out. That's not enough. You actually have to tell the
Point of order, this point that like Anne Frank's diary was able to get out, like I could have mocked this thoroughly in MO, but I wasn't able to because it wasn't enough G.
Also because you took 10.5 minutes.
Taken into consideration on behalf of the
Sure.
My speech keeps lengthening.
The third thing I want to talk about, though, and the final thing I want to criticize on is what is the moral thing to do? Op philosophy has consistently been, if you can't effect this, then this choice doesn't matter. That if somebody else could do it, this choice doesn't matter. Recognize the important thing here is nobody else can do this. There are no firemen coming, and there are people who are passed out on the ground and need to be saved. You are the one who can do this. What we said way back in PMC, and the way that we think you should decide this around is, when you take an action, there are 2 parts of it. The instrumental value of it and the expressive value. When you make this choice, you're not just choosing to do something for these people, you're also making a choice about who you are. And they're right. People shouldn't be obligated to be Mother Teresa. People shouldn't be coerced into being Mother Teresa. But we don't think that that means that given the choice, you shouldn't aspire to be Mother Teresa. And that's what this comes from. By making this choice, you make the statement that you're willing to sacrifice something to the greater good of humanity, to other people's well-being, and you're able to actually become a moral actor. The fact is that we do think you'll be guilty, and there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is because you left people behind without even trying. We think that there's a value to just trying to save the drowning child, even if you can't swim out there. We think that at the end of the day, the only argument they've given against anything in this round is maybe you'll be sad. We don't think the fact that you'll be sad and maybe a little tearful is a reason to give up your obligations to humanity. Look, Mr. Speaker, we all have a type of plague. Everybody in the world is dying in some sense of the word. If you believe that you should help other people, make that transition from the cradle to the grave a little bit easier for everybody. Make it so that everybody really does have a better life, and so that we can work towards something as a community, as humanity, and you should vote side Gov in today's round. We're proud to propose.
Thank you all for joining.